This is TJ Dinsner on behalf of Shacknews. I'm here with Jeff Spock, narrative director on Humankind and at Amplitude Studios. Jeff, thank you for taking the time to talk with me.
It's a pleasure.
So let's just jump right into it. Humankind is a new 4X strategy game from Amplitude Studios and Sega, who are quite the veterans behind this type of genre. So I just want to jump off, starting with that kind of pedigree y'all have. Previous Amplitude games like Endless Space and Endless Legend sort of locked you into your faction once you started. And conversely, Humankind is going to allow you to adopt different cultures as you move through eras. You can start as like a fertile race focused on population, and then later adopt warlike or mercantile values. What was the drive behind allowing players to change so much over the course of a single game?
There was two kind of important design decisions, but even more sort of design philosophies that we had when we wanted to launch the development of Humankind. One was it's exactly this question of typically in 4X games, the one we've done and the ones we've done in other historical 4X games, basically you choose a faction, and that means you choose a play style and you choose a victory condition, and you're kind of on rails through the whole game. You don't have a whole lot of options about shifting your strategy. If something blows up along the way, it's like, well, I guess I start over. So that was kind of something that we were a little tired of. We wanted to try to find a way out of that sort of, handcuffing yourself to a strategy from the choice right at the beginning of the game. And tied to that idea is the fact that you have X victory conditions, and you're shooting for one of those, and that's your long-term goal. So we made two decisions. One was this idea of having fame, the mark you leave on Humankind, rather than the biggest this, the best that, the richest whatever. And we get a lot more flexibility, I think, in the gameplay with that kind of victory condition, and that means that we're not stuck anymore in choosing a single faction and trying to play them all the way through. So that was one philosophical decision. The other one was, I'm sitting here, an American guy working in a studio in France, and my ancestry is British Isles, the continent, a little Central America. We're all a mix of all these cultures, these people, these, whatever DNA strands that came before us. And it seemed to really do a disservice to this like wonderful mix, messy mix that is the human race, to have this sort of conceit where, you're this one people and you play them for 6,000 years. So we really wanted to step back and take a look at that and say, let's get rid of this, one single strategy to win. Let's get rid of this one single people through all of time and revisit sort of from a more, I guess historically realistic is not necessarily, if you can go from, the Olmec to the Romans, but a more accurate from the point of view of the mix of cultures that bring us to the countries and the civilizations we have today. Sorry, these are very long-winded answers. I have a tendency to rattle on a bit, but that's really what we were thinking about.
No, that's perfectly fine. Thank you. It was mentioned in the presentation that the team is actually choosing to put long-term faction quests aside this time around in favor of this adaptive system in which players make their own goals for their culture and civilization as they go. What has it been like creating this new and expanded adaptive system? And what are the challenges behind designing a narrative system that adapts to the continuous availability of player choice?
Yeah, that's clearly when you're coming from, I don't know if you know our games, Endless Space, Endless Legend, but we have these faction quests that are mapped out that run for about 2/3 of the game. And then, there's some other sort of metagame quests that are in there as well. And that's all stuff that's been pre-designed, pre-structured by the design team, by the writers, the narrative designers. And to go from that to this completely different structure where we can't, we can't say what your playthrough is going to be, what cultures we're going to take. So we can't write a meta story for you, right? So what we have to do is figure out how we can completely change the point of view of narrative in a 4X game and come up with a different way to have the player live something that they're creating rather than something that we create for them. So what we've basically done is we've come up with hundreds of historical events, actual fact-based historical occurrences when certain type of cultures, certain types of civilizations either passed through a certain era or came into contact with a certain technology, came in contact with a certain religion, and all these events that we've tailored to mimic these actual historical events can appear in the game. But what's interesting is they're only going to appear if you hit all the prerequisites, and that can be a choice you made between conscripting your army or hiring mercenaries, or a choice you made on the type of religion you want to have. That might come back and be reflected in a gameplay decision you have to make 20 turns, 2 eras, 3 eras later. So what you're going to find as you play through the eras of the game is that there's a narrative that you have been creating based on your choices and your gameplay decisions that's going to have impact further down the line. And so we're looking at between using this kind of reactive narrative system and having fame, your overall impact on humanity, as the basic goals that are driving you. That's what we're putting in there as the narrative content that will lead the player through the game. And it lets you really kind of write your own story. Do you want to go science? Did you start science but you had to go trade? Did you start agrarian and have to go militarist? That's going to be reflected in the choices and the issues run into later in the game. That's really where we're taking the narrative. And in fact, as far as the words and the content, there's more in Humankind than in our previous games. It's just very different.
Awesome. And we didn't see much of culture or religious values in this particular build of the game due to their lack of implementation at this early stage. Although we did see some hints of them through things such as civic choices and empire influence. Can you speak to any of the directions in which these are intended to be fleshed out? Like, will there be diplomatic or religious dominance in Humankind?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's gonna be a lot of sort of social and civic choices and sort of sliders. You're going to have more of a freer society or more of a controlled and autocratic society. What kind of religion are your people going to have? Are you going to have a very government-controlled economy or a more liberal economy? The way you make your gameplay choices are going to situate you on these sliders. And for instance, if you've chosen a certain path in terms of political freedoms, and you butt up against another empire that's chosen a different path, there's going to be some natural osmosis there, and there's going to be some tension caused by that. There might be diplomatic grievances that come out of that. So there's going to be an awful lot of diplomatic choices, diplomatic options, diplomatic constraints. They're going to come out of the way you run your economy, the way you run the society. So there's a lot of interaction going on between these different game systems in order to bring a certain level of sort of organic evolution and challenge to the game, particularly in the later phases of the game. Some of the basic decisions you make at the beginning are going to come back and you go, oh yeah, I see why I have to do either this or this now. So we're going a lot with that kind of thing.
And obviously playstyles are important to keep a game like this interesting. The signs of progress through population or expansion or military might, cultural or religious influence, or trade dominance are there. But as many games have shown before, it can be difficult to sort of ensure that a playstyle doesn't dominate the rest, such as, for example, in Civilization 5, in the early stages of the game before expansions came out, cultural victory was just very, very easy to achieve, as opposed to something like a science victory or a diplomatic victory. Is Amplitude working towards keeping a certain style from altogether overcoming the rest with ease in a Humankind?
Yeah, that's this whole question of game balance is a huge question for us. In the past, we've had a lot of fun doing these totally asymmetric factions. factions that can't use science, the factions that don't need food. And so, we have some experience with this, with trying to balance these asymmetric things. So, we're looking at the different affinities of the cultures, the aesthete, industrialist, mercantile, militarist, agrarian. So we're thinking about, okay, how are those going to play out? How are those going to change through the eras? What combinations of those might make somebody go exponential? We're trying to look at all that. But, we also accept that when we start to make design decisions of this type, we're opening the system for a little bit of abuse maybe later in the game. And these are just design issues and balance issues that we're going to have to keep our eyes on as the development goes. Because it's one of the things we really want to avoid is this ability to kind of min-max the game and say, yeah, but if you choose these guys in this area, these guys in this area, then you kill everyone. That's what we really want to avoid. And you want to avoid that, because it's procedurally generated and the map makes a big difference in your play style. So it's going to be a lot harder to min-max like that when you have to take the terrain into account. And also, we just want to make sure that there's enough balance and enough sort of controls, constraints, and opportunities to say, yeah, I wanted to go through and do this kind of victory, but now, because I did this and I have that and I'm terrain like this, I'm going to go over here. So, we want to keep this kind of thing open to sort of avoid that risk of having this sort of like, oh, geez, just choose the aesthetes in every era and you win. That's really what we want to try to step away from, because you're right. It kind of kills the experience for all the other players.
Mm-hmm. And speaking to another common issue with 4X game design, you sometimes in many games have these periods of the game where you can run out of things to do, whether you're too far along in technology and construction in all of your cities, or enemies and allies are in stalemates and the world is explored. How do you keep the common issue of stagnation in 4X mid or late games from creeping into Humankind?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And it's one that our previous games have been guilty of. We think we're taking steps away from that, where it's like, it's turn 275. I'm obviously going to win. I got to keep hitting end turn until I get there. Yeah, that's definitely an issue. A couple of things are, one is that since we're using this overall fame score, it means that people who did really well early game should try to hang in there to the end game, because maybe they did enough that they could pull out a victory. And conversely, people who didn't do so well in early to mid game hope to maybe pull it out at the end game by pumping up this fame score, by getting extra stars, by doing that kind of thing. So we're hoping that fame is going to keep it interesting all the way to the end. That's one thing. And the other thing is the fact that every time a new era opens up, you have this choice of changing or what we call transcending, where you keep your existing culture even through the next era. So there's going to be, we hope there are going to be decision points there, every 40, 50, 60, 70 turns, where you're going to have to really think about things. You're going to have to change some of the mechanics you've been using to try to keep the game fresh, even in the fairly late stages. But that's going to come through, again, the questions of balance and questions of testing once we have, larger slices of the game out there for the community to play.
Yeah, and going back to that sort of narrative question about cultures and factions and all that, this is a kind of game where, like, traditionally speaking, Amplitude has kind of had the opportunity to sort of write its own factions, write their personalities, and write their traits. Whereas in this game, you're looking at different existing cultural races throughout history, like the Celtics. Right. You're looking at the Persians, the Macedonians.
Exactly.
And I just want to ask, how does it feel changing from sort of where you have these sort of historical factions to work with, and how does the team go about like interpreting their history into what eventually becomes their characteristics and their bonuses in Humankind?
Right. That's something we had to be super careful with, and that came into once we decided we wanted to start with 60 cultures. We had this desire to Keep the ancient era not just in sort of Middle East. The ancient era, we try to find other geographies, other places. And that's both for geographic representation, but also for gameplay representation. We want to have 10 interesting gameplay options every time you change an era, from all across the globe. And so, this is something we really wanted to put a lot of emphasis on. We have a historian on full time. We had a few more on full time earlier. We're using external historians. So we're doing an awful lot to make sure that each of these 60 cultures has, a gameplay affinity and a unique unit and building that really do make sense historically for who they were, how they existed, how they gained their fame, how they made their mark on history. And so there's an awful lot of the time and effort. Previously, the time and effort upstream went into trying to invent new wild alien factions. Now a lot of that time upstream went into saying, okay, we know we got to have these guys in the game, right? Like, say when are you going to have the Chinese in the game? When are you going to have the Persians in the game? When are you going to have the English, the French in the game? At what point in the great scope of human history did they have the most fame? Did they have the greatest impact? How do we represent that in gameplay? There's an awful lot of discussion and research and analysis that had to go on for us to make those decisions. So it's just a totally different system from inventing some crazy four-limbed alien that's going to be like the warmongers. It was fascinating in its own way. It's just using different creative brain cells. Yeah.
Sure. Well, we're coming up against our time, so I would like to say thank you so much for your time.
It really is.
I'm really looking forward to this game. I'm a huge fan of a lot of the Amplitude games. I still play Endless Legend right now.
Excellent. Thank you.
This has been TJ Denzer with Shacknews, talking with Jeff Spock at Amplitude Studios. Humankind, set to launch sometime in 2021. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for coming out and doing it for Shacknews. Can I get a do it for Shacknews?
Do it for Shacknews.